On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, Dr. John Yelnick finished up his final exam of the day at his dental practice in the rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed his patient a toothbrush, told her to come back in 6 months, and then headed into his back office to wrap up. He turned off his computer and made sure he had everything he needed. The next day was his day off, and he didn't want to have to come back because he forgot something. Once he was satisfied, he flicked off the light, walked out through reception, and told the receptionist to have a great night. She waved, and he gave her a big smile. But as soon as John walked out the front door, he let the smile drop off his face. He had a lot of problems recently, and pretending to be happy all day was pretty exhausting. And just because he'd finished work for the week did not mean he could relax now. In fact, it was the opposite. Because waiting for John back at home was a legal document that he could barely even stand to look at. But he knew that tomorrow he was finally going to have to deal with it. John had been trying to psych himself up for this, telling himself it would mark the beginning of a new phase of his life, but it was still very painful. He got into his car, turned on the ignition, pulled out of the parking lot, and began making his way home. It was about a half-mile drive from the dental practice to his house. Blairsville was a tiny little borough, just like a town, not far from Pittsburgh, and it was mostly farmland, with rolling fields of corn and less than 3,500 residents. John had actually grown up here and then left at some point. But it had always been his lifelong dream to eventually come back home and raise a family here. When he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have set up shop in a big city and made a much higher salary right off the bat. But instead, he took what was, to him, an even better deal. He joined the practice of his own childhood dentist, right in downtown Blairsville. And it would turn out that John actually was able to make a lot of money right here in his hometown. Once John joined this practice, the practice took off, in part because John himself was incredibly charming and funny, and especially good with kids. He became the go-to dentist for whole families, and pretty soon he was earning more than he could even spend. He invested in real estate and eventually became a millionaire by the time he was in his 30s. But it was not until John met his wife, Michelle, that his life finally felt complete. John thought Michelle was one of the most beautiful people in the world. She had dark curly hair and striking blue eyes. When he met her, she was a single mother of 2, and to John, that was great, because it meant, basically, she came with a ready-made family. Now, John's friends were worried that Michelle only wanted John for his money, but when his mom got sick with cancer, Michelle immediately became her full-time caregiver. And for John, that was all the proof he needed that she did truly love him. John and Michelle got married in 1997, and shortly after that, they adopted a little boy named JJ and then moved into a big house with a pool. Everything had seemed perfect. But now, John pulled into his new driveway, turned off the ignition, and just sat there, staring at the modest little brick home where he was currently living. He still couldn't understand how everything had fallen apart so completely. John was suddenly tight on money, and his childhood dentist, who was now his business partner, was talking about dissolving their partnership. John had lent tens of thousands of dollars to a bunch of people, and now he was having to ask for it back. And he and Michelle had hit a rough patch that just didn't end, and they both admitted to having affairs. They were now living separately, which was why John was here at this small house, instead of coming home to his big house with the pool. But of all the stressors in John's life, the worst one, by far, was that John was absolutely convinced that someone was going to murder him. Now, this fear had not come totally out of nowhere. A couple of weeks earlier, someone had vandalized John's car with spray paint, and the police had not been able to figure out who did it. And with all the other bad stuff going on in John's life, John had not been able to get over this vandalism. And he slowly became 100% certain that because of this vandalism, it signaled that he was going to get killed, and his murder, like the vandalism, would go unsolved. And he became so sure of this that he sent his attorney $10,000 and told her to use it to investigate if he just suddenly wound up dead. John finally got out of his car and walked up his porch steps and into the house. Then he closed the door behind him and locked it. It felt so empty now without his adopted son, JJ, who John went long stretches without seeing these days. John had renovated one of the upstairs bedrooms for JJ, who was 5 years old, and he even bought a TV and video game console for them to play together that he was going to give him at Christmas. But Christmas had long passed, it was now April, and those Christmas gifts he had bought for JJ were still sitting unopened in a corner. This coming weekend was Easter, and John was hoping to finally see JJ again and give him these late Christmas presents. That would cheer him up. John took off his shoes and walked into his living room. There, on the coffee table, he saw the legal document that he had been avoiding, because it represented the end of the life he had worked so hard to build. The document was a stack of divorce papers. Michelle had filed for divorce 3 years earlier in 2003, but she and John hadn't been able to come to an agreement. They were not fighting to save the marriage. Both of them knew it was broken beyond repair. Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. What John and Michelle were fighting over was JJ. Michelle wanted full custody, but John was not about to just give up his son. But in less than 24 hours, it would all be over. Their lawyers had finally settled on a shared custody agreement, and Michelle had signed it. Tomorrow, it would be John's turn. And the finality of it all was really starting to hit John. He sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, but he was feeling too restless to watch. So he called his aunt, who he was very close to, and he talked with her for a while about the divorce. She tried to make him feel better, but there really wasn't much she could say that would do that. And then when he put the phone down, John just sort of felt like, you know what, I just have to find a way to get through tomorrow, no matter how bad it is. He knew what he should be doing right now is actually reading through the divorce papers one more time, but he was just too tired. So he just stretched out on the couch and fell asleep. And when his back door creaked open, he didn't even hear it. The following day, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Use, who lived next door to John, walked out the front door of his parents' house and across the lawn towards John's house. It was a warm and sunny day, and Zach wanted to play with John's son, JJ. Now, JJ hadn't been around for quite a while, but he did split time between his mother and father's homes, and so Zach had no idea if JJ was here today, but he figured it was worth a shot. But before Zach even climbed up the front steps to John and JJ's house, he saw that something was wrong. There was broken glass all over the porch in front of the door. Zach paused for a second and scanned the porch, looking for where this glass came from, and he noticed the little glass panel to the left of the door had been shattered. When he squinted, he realized there were streaks of red liquid dried right underneath the broken panel and also in the glass itself. Suddenly, Zach's throat got tight and his pulse quickened, and he thought about running away. But he couldn't just leave his friend JJ and his dad if they were in some kind of trouble. So Zach slowly and nervously climbed up the steps to the door and tried the doorknob. But he found it was locked. As carefully as he could, Zach stuck his hand through the broken glass panel and reached up and unlocked the deadbolt. Then he pulled his arm back out, turned the doorknob, and opened the door. At first, when Zach stepped inside the house, he couldn't really process what he was even looking at. There were papers strewn all over the floor, and Zach could clearly see JJ's dad. But JJ's dad, John, was laying motionless face up on the floor inside the living room. It took Zach a second to realize that the floor all around John was soaked with blood. And when Zach looked more closely at John, he realized John's throat had been slit from ear to ear. Zach turned and ran. About 15 minutes later, Janelle Leidick of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving with her husband and 4 kids when she got a call from police dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally quiet residential street. Dispatch just said there apparently had been a cardiac arrest, and so Corporal Leidick was needed right now at the scene. Corporal Leidick tried to get more information to determine, how urgent this was, but there really wasn't any more information. And so she made the decision to just go straight there with her family still in her car. But the second she pulled up at the scene and got out of her car, she could tell that this could not just be a heart attack, because she could see there was a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and his face looked grim. Leidick quickly walked towards him and asked what was going on, and he just pointed at the broken glass and the blood on the porch, and then told her, just go inside and see for yourself. So Leidick, who was pretty apprehensive at this point, stepped inside the house, and she saw the foyer was splashed with blood all over the floor and the walls, and there, lying on the ground in the middle of the living room, was a horribly mutilated dead body. Right away, Leidick knew this had to be a murder, not only because the body was mutilated, but because she could clearly see numerous stab wounds all over the body. so many that there was no way this person could have self-inflicted. And even though Leidick had never handled a homicide case before, she knew immediately that what she needed right now was backup. Because dispatch had somehow recorded this 911 call as a cardiac arrest, the police had not sent a full emergency response, and so Leidick and the patrol officer outside were the only people on the scene. Leidick was worried that the killer could still be in the area, or maybe in the house. And now she realized she had brought her kids with her. So she sent the patrol officer into the house to search it, while she went back outside to the front yard to stand between the murder scene and her family, guarding them with her gun. It was not long before a fleet of police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances descended on this quiet residential street. At the same time, the patrol officer who had searched the house came outside to report that it was empty. The killer, whoever they were, was gone. The only thing the officer had found was a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim clearly had bled through from the floor above. Once her backup arrived on scene and she had sent her family home, Corporal Leidick went back inside the house to assess just what kind of crime scene she was looking at. By now, she had the victim's name, John Yelnick. As the crime scene technicians started their work processing the physical evidence, Leidick began a slow walk through each room, trying to get a sense of who John was and how he died. John's body was close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that preceded his death had been long and chaotic. There was blood all over the floor in the living room, which was strewn with papers. And when Leidick looked more closely, she realized these papers were divorce papers, and they too were covered in blood. Despite John being found barefoot, there were bloody shoe prints leading from the living room through the dining room towards the back door. They were too big to belong to the boy who had found the body, so Leidick figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene technicians were already measuring the prints to determine the killer's shoe size. As Leidick continued to walk around, she didn't see anything that she thought could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The electronics that she could see were out in the open, so they weren't taken. No drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened, and none of the closets looked like they had been rifled through. And so to Leidick, it really did not appear that this was a robbery. Not only because of what she was seeing in terms of things not being taken, but also, more specifically, just how gruesome the crime was. I mean, to stab someone over and over and over again and mutilate their bodies, that is personal. That's not just some robber who happened upon John in the process of the robbery. So very likely, whoever the killer was, the only thing they wanted to do when they entered this home was for John to die. Leidick finished her sweep of the scene, ending up back in the living room, where it looked to her like the attack had most likely begun. And that's when she noticed a check lying on the coffee table. She had overlooked it somehow before, but now she bent over to read it. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for the amount of $15,000 from the bank account of somebody named Melissa Use. When she saw this last name, Leidick did a double take. Use was the last name of the boy, the neighbor, who had discovered the body. She wondered if Melissa Use was related to that boy. Attached to this check was also a note asking John to hold off for a few days before depositing it. And so at this point, Corporal Leidick had two good leads. The first lead was her victim clearly was in the middle of a divorce. And the second lead was someone, maybe his next door neighbor, whoever this Melissa Use person was, owed him a lot of money that apparently she could not quite afford to pay back just yet. It was evening by the time Leidick stepped back outside the house, and when she did, she saw a crowd of neighbors and reporters jostling each other on the street. Blairsville almost never had murders, and she knew this was going to be a big story. She needed to head back to the station to get organized for interviews tomorrow. But before she could walk down the steps, one of the other officers on scene came up to her with an update. Police had fanned out to question the neighbors and see if they had heard anything, and they'd come back with two very interesting stories. The first account came from a woman who said that around 1:30 that morning, she had heard a scream. It woke her up, and she had run to check on her kids, but her kids had been fine, so she had just gone back to bed, thinking she was just being jumpy. The second account came from another neighbor who had heard something a bit more specific. Right around the same time that first neighbor had heard the scream, or maybe a little bit after that, this neighbor heard a man yelling in what sounded like a heated argument. The neighbor couldn't make out everything the man said, but they definitely heard one sentence very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." Instantly, Leidick thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. The officer had one more important piece of information for Leidick. In addition to these witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family on the block that detectives should really look into. And that was the Use family. The Use boy, Zach, was the one who found the body, and it was his mother, Melissa Use, whose name was on that check. And there was one more member of the Use family, and that was Melissa's husband, Tom. Tom was in the Navy, and he was away a lot, but over the last 24 hours, he had been home, so he was here when John was killed. Critically, the neighbors told the cops that there were rumors that Melissa Use and John Yelnick were having an affair. And so when Leidick heard this, she knew exactly where her investigation was going to start. The following day, April 14th, Leidick had Melissa and Tom Use brought down to the station and put in an interview room for questioning. At this point, so early in the investigation, Leidick was casting a very wide net. She had never done a murder case before, but she was methodical by nature and liked to do everything slowly and thoroughly. She even talked slowly in a kind of monotone voice, and she didn't like it when anyone tried to rush her. So her plan was to go pretty hard at Melissa and Tom Use because of that $15,000 check, the rumors of the affair, and the witness account of a fight about loaned money on the night of the murder. But Leidick was also very interested in John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle. The night before, Leidick had sent a police officer to tell Michelle that her husband was dead. But when the officer got to Michelle's house, he found that she somehow already knew, although she said she had heard that John died of a heart attack. The officer had broken the news to Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin Foley, who was there, that no, John had actually been murdered. And when he told them that, Michelle had seemed, or at least acted, genuinely shocked. Corporal Leidick actually knew Michelle's boyfriend Kevin Foley personally, because he was a state police trooper, they had worked together, and at one point she had quite literally trusted him with her life. But in a murder case, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2, and Leidick knew that. However, before she began grilling Kevin or Michelle with some hard questions, she decided she would first eliminate all other suspects. She also wanted to get the results of the autopsy, which was being conducted that day. Basically, she wanted to be really thorough before she went in on Kevin and Michelle. So now, Leidick walked into the interview room where John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use, were waiting side by side at a table. Leidick sat down and began very bluntly by asking what was the deal with that $15,000 check Melissa had written to John. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since 9th grade and she was planning to open up a new bakery in town. And John had loaned her the $15,000 to help her out, but then sort of out of nowhere, he had asked for the money back. Melissa said she had been very disappointed, but at the same time, she knew John was in the middle of a long and probably quite expensive divorce, so she understood. She'd only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote that check, and so she had said that's why she'd left that note for John, asking him not to cash it for a few days while she got the last $1,000 together. Leidick watched Melissa closely as she gave her statement, and she decided that if Melissa was lying, she was doing a very convincing job of it. She sounded genuinely distraught over John's death, and like the money really didn't matter given the context. But for Leidick, the obvious warmth that Melissa felt for John raised another, more sensitive question. And in her typically blunt way, Leidick didn't dance around it, even though Melissa was sitting there right next to her husband, Tom. Leidick looked right at Melissa and said, "Were you having an affair with John?" Melissa instantly went red and said no. She said they were close friends, but nothing more. Leidick turned to Melissa's husband, Tom. He looked very uncomfortable, but Leidick didn't care. She asked him the same thing. Is Melissa having an affair with John? For a second, Tom didn't say anything, and Leidick wasn't really sure what to expect. This kind of question could be so offensive to some people or just plain hurtful. But when Tom spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He refused to answer Leidick directly and instead just kept repeating over and over again that he really needed to leave to go take care of the kids. And that persisted basically for the rest of their interview. He just didn't answer her question. And so by the time Leidick just wrapped it up and told Melissa and Tom Hughes they could go, Tom had firmly established himself, at least in Leidick's mind, as a clear person of interest. Before Leidick left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her police officers who she had sent to go observe the autopsy of her victim. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined that the killer had used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during a fight that must have been at least a few minutes long. John had clear defensive wounds on his hands as well as cuts on his back, which suggested he'd tried to run away. And in addition to the knife wounds, his jugular had also been cut by glass. It was an absolutely brutal way to kill someone. Everyone that Leidick and her officers had spoken to had described John Yelnick in glowing terms. He was a simple guy who loved classic movies and old music and liked to dance the polka even though he was terrible at it. At his dental practice, his favorite patients were the kids, who he could always make laugh. He was a devoted dad who loved going to his stepson's hockey games. It just didn't square with the violence described in the autopsy report. Somebody had hated him enough to basically hack him to death in a wild frenzy. Corporal Leidick felt like she had one very good suspect in Tom Hughes. I mean, he had acted very suspicious in the interview, and because he didn't answer the question about the affair, maybe he thought his wife was having an affair with John, and that's why he attacked John. However, because Leidick had never done a homicide investigation before, she was very weary of not focusing too hard on one lead or one suspect. She wanted to keep her mind open and make sure she didn't miss anything. Also, she wanted to appear capable in front of her superiors and show them that she was running down every possible lead. And this brought up another concern that Leidick had, and that was she didn't want to share her investigation with any other police agency. The officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples, which Leidick was supposed to send to a state police lab for DNA testing. But now that Leidick had them, she didn't want to give them to anybody else. And Leidick was a pretty stubborn person. So, to keep her investigatory options open, and to guarantee that she knew every single thing going on with her evidence, she decided not to send the samples to the state police lab. Instead, she put them in the department refrigerator and went home. The following day was April 15th, 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered, and Corporal Leidick had decided to start her day at John's dental practice, speaking to his colleagues. She had already had her officers canvass John's neighborhood. That's how she'd gotten the witness statement about the fight over a loan, and also she had heard about the rumors centered on the Hughes family. Now she wanted to know how other people in John's life viewed him. And as soon as she arrived at John's office, she was glad she had come, because the dental hygienists and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. This was because during the long, awful, drawn-out fight John and Michelle had over their divorce, Michelle had at some point lodged allegations against John that he abused their adopted son JJ. Even Michelle's own family hadn't believed her, and officials had declined to press charges. But at one point during the back and forth, Michelle had also accused John of violating a stay-away order, and police had come and arrested him at work. John's colleagues thought Michelle was a total nightmare. She called the office all the time to demand money, and John often caved and gave it to her. In fact, one of the hygienists told Corporal Leidick that Michelle had called just a few days before the murder. However, this time, John had refused to speak to her. This detail caught Leidick's ear. A lot of John's friends had described Michelle as money-hungry. They said it was Michelle who wanted the huge house and the pool, and that John really never felt comfortable living in such a nice place. He still drove an old car with 100,000 miles on it. It was like when he got rich, he didn't know how to act rich. But Michelle definitely did, and John's friends and colleagues said that was a big part of what ultimately drove the couple apart. Now, Leidick did not believe Michelle was physically capable of murdering John the way he was killed. I mean, clearly, John was overpowered and brutalized. However, she did have enough money to potentially hire someone to do it for her. And adding more credibility to that theory, Leidick's team had just pulled the paperwork on John's life insurance policy, and they discovered that it listed Michelle as the beneficiary. And with his death, she stood to inherit more than $1 million. The dental hygienists and the receptionist at John's practice didn't know of any other money disputes John was having. and they said he got on well with his business partner, regardless of any conversations they might have had about, splitting up their practice. Their suspicions were aimed squarely at Michelle. And now, so were Corporal Leidick's. She was not ready to write off Tom Use. He was clearly a main suspect. But it sort of felt like she now had two major suspects, Tom and Michelle. As Leidick left the dental office, she thought about how she was going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Leidick did not want to make her move too soon, without enough ammunition. After all, this was the biggest case she had ever worked. Reporters were calling her constantly, everybody was asking her about it, and so the last thing she wanted to do was act prematurely and screw this thing up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after his murder. And Corporal Leidick knew that his friends and family were already beginning to get antsy about why this investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. But she did understand where they were coming from. After all, John himself had been convinced he was about to be murdered and that the case would never be solved, and he was very vocal about it, and so Leidick could see that it was starting to look to the people that loved him like his prediction was coming true. But Leidick also felt like John's friends and family simply didn't understand. Leidick was being careful, not just slow. She was a perfectionist, and she wanted to do the investigation her way. Without any departmental guidance on how to actually work a homicide, she had developed a method of her own. She knew that some homicide detectives like to start their investigations with the people closest to their victim, but Leidick was going to focus on the outside edges of the case and work her way in. She felt like this was the most methodical approach. So, for the next several months, Leidick did that and took her time. The crime scene unit had not turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the scene, and the bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of Leidick's suspects. Leidick still had not turned in the evidence she had stored in the Blairsville refrigerator, so for now, she was relying on interviews. Leidick ran down every single tip and rumor she found, systematically ruling things out one by one. She had heard talk that John's partner in the dental practice wanted to stop working together, so she questioned him, but quickly ruled him out. Just like the hygienist and the receptionist at the practice had said, the men were close friends with no bad blood. They just maybe didn't want to work together. Leidick had heard lots of talk about how generous John was, so she tracked down every single person she could who John had lent money to. One of those people was John's cousin, Tracy Jacobs. Tracy had borrowed $20,000 to start a lawn care business, and so Leidick brought Tracy down to the station to take a lie detector test. But Tracy passed. And as spring became summer, that was just how it went. Leidick brought one person after another down to the station, made them take lie detector tests, and then scratched them off her list. As she did this, she kept tabs on her two best suspects, Tom Use and Michelle Yelnick, but she made no move to arrest either one. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John Yelnick's family about her failure to solve the case quickly did get to her, but she felt like she was doing the best job she could. She was doing this maybe a little bit unorthodox, but she felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Use hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder, when Corporal Leidick got a call from Melissa Use. Leidick had been surprised to hear from Melissa, and even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. When Leidick showed up, Melissa was standing on the sidewalk with two older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said she had met them at a psychic tea party, and they had visions about this case. Now, Leidick admittedly was not thrilled at the idea of psychics potentially getting involved in this case. She felt like, how could they possibly advance this case? She was already all over it. Why do we need them? But she also knew that John's family was getting really edgy, and apparently they had given Melissa permission to bring these psychics into John's house and look around, and so if Leidick wanted more time to work on this case, she just needed to placate them. And so if that meant working with psychics contacted by one of the suspect's wives, then that was what Leidick was going to do. So Leidick trailed Melissa Use and the psychic sisters, tried not to roll her eyes, as the sisters began walking through John's yard. First, the sisters said they felt some hot and also cold patches on the property. When they walked up the stairs and went inside, they looked around the house, which had not been cleaned out after the murder, and said they thought the killing happened in the dining room area, which was still spattered with blood. The psychic said they saw a knife and stab wounds and a bloody footprint, and then they said the killer drove a black or red car and that the killer was not Melissa Yuce's husband, Tom. Melissa looked visibly excited by everything the psychics were saying, but Leidick thought it was totally ridiculous. The blood inside the house made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened, and the huge police investigation that followed had been all over the news. And so the things they were pointing out about, what could have happened in the house were sort of public knowledge. And then the fact that these psychics, who remember, Melissa herself has brought here, like she's commissioned these psychics, are now exonerating Melissa's husband, was just not very convincing. And so as the group walked out of the house, the only thing Leidick thought these psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off her slow but steady investigation. She knew that by this point, John Yelnick's family had lost faith in her. But she still had one more thing she wanted to try. She just needed to wait for the right time. And 10 months after the murder, in February of 2007, Corporal Leidick got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to take over the investigation from Corporal Leidick. Leidick's cooperation with the psychics had bought her a little bit of goodwill and time with the families, but ultimately, both John's family and Melissa Yuce had gotten more and more agitated by Leidick's slow pace. They began to feel like the psychics had given them as much information as Leidick had. And the Attorney General agreed. Not enough progress was being made. This meant that Leidick was losing her case. And on one hand, this was exactly the thing that she'd been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over her investigation. But the Attorney General's office was not the agency Leidick had expected to do that. And so now, even though it stung, Leidick realized that she could finally make the play she had been sitting on for almost a year. She went to the refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and she took out the container of fingernail clippings that her officer had brought back from John Yelnick's autopsy, which had been conducted the day after the murder. Leidick had been supposed to send the fingernails along with the other tissue samples to the state police crime lab, but in what she knew was probably a breach of protocol, she had not done that. Instead, she had hidden them in this fridge. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in and getting involved in this case, it sort of made the case much more high profile, which in turn allowed Leidick to send these samples directly to the federal crime lab or the FBI crime lab. Normally, the FBI would just not take samples for a small-town murder case, which is what this was all the way up until this point. But again, the case was not that anymore. The Attorney General stepping in and taking over had elevated this case, giving Leidick access to the FBI crime lab. So she repackaged the fingernail clippings and sent them off to the FBI and waited. The day that the results came in, Leidick was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened up the email with the DNA results, when she read what was on the screen, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was looking at, because her strategy of slow playing the investigation had totally paid off. Finally, Leidick was looking at the name of John's killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and then tested by the FBI, the following is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to John Yelnick in the early hours of April 13th, 2006. The killer drove through Blairsville in their red car sometime after 12:15 a.m. A little after 12:30 a.m., they drove down a quiet residential street and pulled up to a modest little brick home, and then cut their lights. They climbed out of their car and looked around to make sure nobody was watching, but the neighborhood was dark. As quietly as they could, they crept around to the back of the house and slipped inside, going through an unlocked back door. They walked through the kitchen, then the dining room, and into the living room, where they found John asleep on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist, and they raised it in the air and then brought it down on John. Instantly, John woke up screaming these horrible high-pitched screams. He put his hands up to protect himself and clawed at the killer, getting their skin under his fingernails. but the killer kept slashing and cutting at John's hands, so John rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. As John stumbled in the dark, the killer chased after him, and at some point they began to wrestle, knocking the divorce papers on the coffee table onto the floor, where John's blood splashed all over them as he flailed his wounded arms. John finally broke away and ran for the front door, but the killer was close behind, still slashing at John's back. John made it out of the living room and into the foyer, and he was reaching for the front door when the killer shoved him. John's head broke through the glass, and he made a strangled sound as the broken shards severed his jugular. The killer yanked John back into the house, wary of waking up the neighbors. By now, John was already clearly dying, but the killer decided they couldn't leave anything to chance. And so, with one brutal motion, they slashed their knife all the way across John's throat. The killer let John slump to the ground, and then they watched until John went still. Then, the killer turned and left the home. The killer was confident they would never be caught, because they knew the police in Blairsville quite literally trusted them with their lives. John's killer was not Tom Hughes, or Michelle Yelnick, or a hitman hired by Michelle. However, the killer was connected to Michelle. It was Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley, Michelle's new boyfriend. And this fact explained the unbelievably slow pace of the murder investigation, and Corporal Leidick's decision not to send all her evidence to the state police crime lab. Leidick knew Kevin Foley, and she liked and trusted him. Initially, she had not wanted to believe he could be a killer. But as soon as her investigation began, she began to hear about how much Foley seemed to hate John. In fact, he talked openly about wanting John to die, in part because of the allegations that Michelle had made, that John abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled unfounded, it seemed that Foley still believed them. Leidick had become increasingly paranoid that Foley was the killer and that her case would be taken over not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was afraid that if Foley was guilty, then she couldn't trust the state police crime lab. And so to keep complete control over her investigation, she had opted to keep all those samples from the autopsy, including the fingernails, even though she knew they likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, basically biding her time until she could figure out what she was going to do. And then basically her hands were tied when, a year later, the Attorney General came in and took the case over because basically Leidick looked like she was being incompetent. But when they stepped in, it gave Leidick access to the federal crime lab, the FBI crime lab. And so when she sent the samples off to them, not worried about Kevin Foley getting involved, the FBI scientists finally tested the DNA under the fingernails and found that it was a match for Kevin Foley. Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michelle was not charged in connection with the case. In 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a baby shower in Baltimore, Maryland that was being held for them by Kathy's family. It would be a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio, so Mark and Kathy tried to get out the door as early as possible, but one thing led to another and they got a pretty late start. By midnight, they were only about an hour away from their final destination, but they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so they pulled into a rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. The rest area parking lot was completely vacant except for one car, which was a dark blue late model 4-door sedan that was parked head-in right in front of the bathroom. Mark and Kathy pulled into a spot that was a few over from the sedan. They got out, they walked up to the restroom. Mark was done first, so he waited outside of the women's restroom for his wife. As he waited, he turned around to face the sedan that initially, when he first pulled in the lot, he believed was empty. But now, as he's looking at it, he can clearly see there are 2 people in the front 2 seats. A middle-aged man who's sitting behind the steering wheel looking directly at Mark, and then next to this guy is a sleeping teenager. And immediately, Mark felt really creeped out by these 2 guys. I mean, they are in this random rest stop in the middle of the night. They're the only ones there, and this guy is just staring menacingly at Mark. And so Mark's doing his best not to be intimidated and to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening right in front of him. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying his wife comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible so they can get the heck out of here and away from these two creepy guys. Finally, his wife did come out. He grabbed her by the hand and without any explanation, rushed them back to their car, hopped in, locked the doors, turned it on, and began backing out. And as he did, he looked over at the sedan and he saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged guy, was looking over at Mark with that same menacing look on his face. Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-size hole right above the license plate where you would normally put the key inside of. So the whole scene was just totally bizarre, and after Mark and Kathy sped out and were back on the highway, Mark explained to Kathy that there were actually two people inside of that sedan and they really creeped him out, and that's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car. And so she agreed that was pretty creepy, but by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had completely forgotten about their experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio. About a week later, the couple was watching TV in their home when a breaking news bulletin came across, and it showed a reporter who was standing at the exact same rest stop that they had stopped in on the way to Baltimore in Frederick County, Maryland, and behind them was the same late model sedan that they had seen parked at that rest stop when they had pulled in. The headline of this special news bulletin was DC Snipers Caught. It would turn out that middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan staring at Mark was none other than John Allen Muhammad, and the guy next to him, the teenager who was sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the two men that were responsible for the highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that left 10 people dead in the Washington, D.C. area. The fist-size hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through because it allowed them to stay concealed in the trunk while they were shooting. Mohammed and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy pulled in next to them, they were only halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his wife were not targeted is because the killers most likely were trying to keep this rest stop off the radar because it was their hiding spot, and so they wouldn't have risked an attack there. Although, ironically, they would ultimately be caught in that rest stop. Mohammed was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Malvo is serving a life sentence. Our next story is called Luggage. From the time Gareth Williams was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. And after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies, and they began recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's communication headquarters, commonly known as GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted the job, dropped out of Cambridge, and then moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, which is the resort town about 88 miles away from London where GCHQ is located. And there he would live and work for the next 10 years. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth was a highly valued team player whose genius in mathematics and technology helped his group win a number of Britain's highest awards for international code breaking. In 2009, one of Britain's other main intelligence agencies, the famous Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 for short, they were so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job to come over and work for them. This was a very rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a spy in the kind of Hollywood sense of the word. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond, and so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving to London, he regretted his decision. He hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars and flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared he felt that way. But at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. Before he left MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London. And for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anybody looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer from Gareth, the officer got the key to the apartment from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth. There was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs to see if maybe Gareth was up there. He's yelling for him the whole way as he's going up. He gets to the second floor. There's nobody up there, but there's a closed door. And what he finds on the other side of that closed door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and there was nothing unusual about the bathroom, except in the bathtub there was this big red duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were no fingerprints on the rim or inside the bathtub. There were also no fingerprints on the bag itself, or on the two zippers, or on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby sitting on a table, and it had been factory reset. And later, investigators would determine it had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on CCTV footage, and it was also the day that they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it. There was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed that he had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat inside of Gareth's apartment was jacked way up, so it was very hot inside of his apartment, despite the fact it was summer and it was the height of the summer in August. But regardless, the excessive heat in his apartment sped up the decomposition process and made it impossible to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth, although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mafia, which would have made him a target. Another theory is MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent has come out and said he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and said that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it all down, removing fingerprints and DNA evidence. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least one time he'd had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when two experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar-sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, all over the lock, the zippers, all over the tub? Because when he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident and was closed 3 years after his death. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Bear, the Plane, and the Duffel. In early December of 1985, in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia, a hunter was very carefully making his way through the trees trying to track a deer. Now, this hunter had been tracking this deer for over a mile, but it had been a while since he had seen any signs of it being anywhere nearby. And as this hunter continued to creep along, he became increasingly aware of how loud each of his steps were, because the ground all around him was covered in dry leaves, and so every step he was taking was creating a loud crunching sound. And so eventually this hunter just came to a stop and decided stalking this deer was totally pointless because he was basically scaring it away with these crunching sounds as he got closer to it. But before this hunter was ready to just give up and head back to his vehicle, he continued on a little bit further, and when he pushed through this particularly dense brush area, he saw this clearing up ahead. And the second he saw what was in this clearing, he froze, took a step back into the brush, and then ducked down behind a rock. Because in that clearing, he saw an animal, and it wasn't a deer. It was a huge American black bear. Now, generally speaking, American black bears are not aggressive towards humans. However, if, for example, you were to accidentally sneak up on a black bear, like this hunter had done, and you suddenly startled it by just showing your presence, the bear might react by pouncing on you and ripping you to bits. And so this hunter, with his back pressed up against the rock and his rifle gripped tightly across his chest, he's thinking about that and wondering what he's going to do to get out of this situation. At first he thought, okay, I'll just stand up and quietly walk away. But then he remembered how loud the leaves were, and even though he had been lucky walking in, he hadn't alerted the bear to his presence. On the way out, he was worried he wouldn't be so lucky that those leaves would alert the bear to his position. And so the hunter began thinking, okay, well, what if I just stand up and start shooting at this bear? But the hunter knew the big issue with that plan is he had a deer hunting rifle, which is not nearly powerful enough to quickly take down a black bear, if at all. And so if he starts shooting at this bear, there was a very good chance that the bear would just turn around and maul him before he was able to put the bear down with his rifle. And so as this hunter is going through these scenarios behind the rock, he realizes something. He hasn't heard this bear at all. Now, bears in general are very loud animals. Just their regular breathing is so guttural and noisy that you can hear it a pretty good distance away. And the hunter's thinking to himself, I can't hear it breathing. And come to think of it, I haven't heard this bear once since I've been near it. And so the hunter very carefully stood up from behind his rock and turned around. And then he kind of peered forward into the brush, looking back into this clearing. And when he spotted the bear again, he realized immediately the bear was dead. The bear was kind of slumped forward and its body almost looked like a deflated balloon. The hunter was so relieved, he almost started laughing. And so he stepped out from behind his rock and he made his way through the brush into the clearing to get a better look at this bear. And when the hunter was right over the top of this bear looking down at it, something immediately struck him as very odd. This bear was far too young to have died of natural causes. However, after this hunter kind of poked and prodded the bear and lifted it up on either side to try to look underneath it, he couldn't see any visible injuries. It was like this bear had just randomly dropped dead. But the hunter didn't spend much time thinking about what happened to this bear. Instead, he thought to himself, there has to be some sort of logical explanation for what killed it. And with one last look at the bear on the ground, the hunter turned around and began the long walk back through the woods back to his vehicle. It would turn out there was an explanation for what happened to that bear. However, it was anything but logical. But to get to that non-logical explanation, we first have to go back in time. Around 11:30 p.m. on September 10th, 1985, so 3 months before the hunter discovered this dead bear, 2 pilots were flying their little 6-seater Cessna airplane over northern Georgia, making their way north towards Tennessee. And as these pilots flew along very casually, they suddenly intercepted over their radio a voice message that they definitely were not supposed to hear. It sounded like other pilots communicating with each other, and what they were talking about was how they were now going to follow this little Cessna airplane that they could see that was currently flying over northern Georgia. Now, radio traffic like this can only really be intercepted if your radio that's doing the intercepting is physically close to the person doing the transmitting. And so knowing this, the 2 pilots in this little Cessna knew that whoever was talking about following that little Cessna, they had to be talking about them, the 2 pilots in that Cessna. Now, for most pilots, if you suddenly overheard a radio transmission that your plane was getting followed by some other pilots, you might reach out to those pilots and say, hey, why are you following me? What's going on? Now, the co-pilot of this little Cessna might have wanted to react that way. However, before he could, the main pilot stopped him and said, I actually know exactly why somebody might want to tail us, and unfortunately, we're both going to have to jump out of this plane. Before the co-pilot could really even react to this news, the main pilot had set the Cessna on autopilot, which sets the plane to fly in a straight direction going at a constant speed at a constant altitude until either a pilot comes back and takes the craft back over, or if it just stays on autopilot, it eventually will run out of fuel and crash or run into something. And so after the main pilot had done that, he turned to the co-pilot and gestured for him to come with him into the main cabin of the aircraft, basically the main body of the craft where all their luggage was. And the co-pilot, he's so confused about what's happening, he's so panicked that he just follows the main pilot. So the two of them, they climb back over the two front seats that go into the main body of the craft, and the main pilot begins strapping parachutes onto some of their luggage. And as he's doing this, he tells the co-pilot to open up the side door of the plane. And so again, the co-pilot is just so caught off guard, he has no idea how to handle this, and so he reaches over and he slides open this door of this moving plane. And as soon as he did, this huge rush of cold night air blasted inside of the cabin, and it became so loud from the howling wind coming in that the two pilots couldn't even talk to each other. And then the main pilot just began pushing the luggage out of the plane just into the night, falling straight down to the ground far, far below them. And at some point, the co-pilot just joined him and began pushing the luggage out of the plane. And then after all the luggage was out, the main pilot shoved a parachute into the hands of the co-pilot and said, put it on. He had to gesture for it because they couldn't hear each other. And so as this co-pilot's struggling to get on his parachute, the main pilot puts on his chute. And then right after the co-pilot has just barely got his parachute on, the main pilot pushes him out the side of the plane, and then the main pilot jumps out after him. So they basically abandoned their plane, which was still set to autopilot, so at some point, it was just going to crash. About 5 hours later, in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee, an 85-year-old man named Fred Meyers was just waking up. Fred always got up before sunrise. It was part of his daily routine. He would wake up, he would get dressed, he would wash and shave his face, and then he would sit down and read the local newspaper. This simple routine was actually very important to Fred because recently he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive disease that destroys memory. And so having this sort of set routine helped him manage his symptoms. Basically, at least in the morning, he could go into autopilot and go through this routine and not get confused. However, on this particular morning, something would happen that would leave Fred more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. Fred had made it to his bathroom, he had washed his face, and he had begun shaving when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange outside in his driveway. He could see it through a nearby window, but it was still so dark outside, Fred couldn't tell what this thing was out there. And so feeling very curious, Fred put his razor blade down and he made his way over to the window to get a better look. And when he reached the window and looked out at his driveway and saw what this strange thing was, he could not believe his eyes. There was this huge parachute out on his driveway, and on the parachute was the main pilot of the Cessna. After the main pilot had pushed the co-pilot out and leapt out himself, when he pulled his ripcord, his chute either didn't deploy or when it deployed, it didn't inflate fully, and so he was forced to go to his reserve chute, but it didn't inflate fast enough to stop him from crashing into the ground. And so the main pilot slammed into the ground, basically at terminal velocity, and so he sustained catastrophic internal injuries, and he died within a couple of minutes of hitting the ground. Fred was so stunned and confused at what he was looking at that without saying a word, he just turned away from his window and walked over to his phone and called the police, shaving cream still on his face. When the police arrived at Fred's house that morning, they were expecting to see a dead recreational skydiver on Fred's property. But when they walked up the driveway and saw the dead man for themselves, they knew right away this was not some recreational skydiver. He actually looked more like a soldier. He was wearing a bulletproof vest over some camouflage fatigues, and he had night vision goggles strapped to his head. But the dead man's shoe choice made the police think this guy could not possibly have been military, because on this guy's feet were not military-style combat boots like you would expect with the rest of his getup. Instead, he was wearing loafers, specifically Gucci loafers, so very expensive designer shoes. And so the police are thinking to themselves, who the heck was this guy and what was he doing? The police would figure that out. However, first, we have to fast forward 2 months to late November 1985, so roughly 2 weeks before that bear was discovered by that hunter in Chattahoochee National Forest. Now, at this point in late November, that black bear was alive and well and living a typical black bear life in the Chattahoochee National Forest, which meant he mostly spent his time wandering around the woods looking for something to eat. And on this particular day in November, the bear was doing just that when out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something strange lying on the forest floor. It was one of the pieces of luggage that the 2 pilots had pushed out of their plane. It was this big, heavy duffel bag. Now, the bear had no idea if this duffel bag contained food, but the bear was optimistic, so it meandered its way over and began pawing at the bag with its massive claws, and pretty much immediately, his claws tore open a hole in this bag. And suddenly, the air all around this bear was filled with this glorious, flowery smell. So the bear put its nose directly into this rip in the bag and began sniffing and licking the contents of this bag. And apparently, the bear just loved it because it ate whatever was inside of the bag, all of it. And when he was done, the bear felt so good, he was so full of energy that he just started sprinting in a straight direction. And after running at top speed about 100 yards, every major system inside of this bear shut down all at once and he died on the spot, collapsing in that clearing. And then, about 2 weeks later, that hunter walked into the Chattahoochee National Forest and discovered this dead bear. And then, within 24 hours, the hunter was back home and he told one of his friends about discovering this dead bear. And when he told his friend about seeing this bear, he also kind of casually mentioned that he had seen a duffel bag in the forest not far from this dead bear. Now, to understand what this friend did next, you need some context. By this point in time, the police had actually figured out a lot about that dead man on Fred Meyers' driveway, the main pilot of the Cessna. They knew he was a 40-year-old man named Andrew Thornton, who had served in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper. But after getting out of the service, he had kind of gone astray in his life and become a big-time smuggler of illegal goods. The police had also figured out by this point that Andrew, along with a co-pilot, had been the people flying that Cessna that eventually was found crashed into a mountainside in North Carolina. The co-pilot had survived the jump out of the Cessna, and so the police tracked him down, and they very quickly realized this co-pilot was really just a victim of Andrew. Andrew had told this guy they were just going to fly to the Bahamas for a vacation. And so when that plan completely evaporated, and suddenly Andrew is barking orders at this guy to open up the plane and push the luggage out and jump out, the co-pilot said he just totally panicked and just started doing whatever Andrew wanted. And so this guy was just totally terrified, and really all he could offer police was just to confirm that, yup, Andrew was the main pilot, and yes, we really did push his luggage out of the side of the plane over some forest in northern Georgia. The police believed the co-pilot and did not charge him with any crime. The police would go and search all over northern Georgia, and they would find the majority of the missing bags. However, they knew they were still missing some, and they knew they really needed to recover them. And so, around the time that this hunter is telling his friend about this bear encounter and this duffel bag, the police were constantly having news outlets tell people in northern Georgia that if you see one of these duffel bags attached to a big parachute or something, please come forward and tell us. We are looking for these. And so the hunter's friend thought, you know what? That duffel bag he mentioned out in Chattahoochee National Forest, which is in northern Georgia, might be one of those bags. And so the friend called authorities. Authorities were thrilled to get this tip, and so they charged out to the Chattahoochee National Forest, and they made their way out to where this dead bear was, and then sure enough, about 100 yards away from this bear was this bag, and it was one of the bags they were missing. Except the bag was empty. Because, as we already know,
that black bear had eaten everything inside of this bag. And as you might have guessed, that bag, along with every other bag that had been cast out of the Cessna that night, was full of cocaine. Because Andrew was a drug smuggler. And on the night he and his co-pilot leapt from the Cessna, he was trying to smuggle 900 pounds of cocaine from South America into the United States. That transmission that Andrew and the co-pilot suddenly overheard on their radio as they were cruising along in their Cessna was the sound of federal agents within the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency who had been tipped off about Andrew's big drug run, and so they really had sent 2 planes to go follow him and potentially intercept him. And so the authorities standing in the Chattahoochee National Forest looking down at this empty duffel bag had no idea where the cocaine went that was supposed to be inside of it. But on a hunch, they decided to bring the body of the dead black bear back with them and perform an autopsy on it. And sure enough, during this autopsy, the medical examiner would open up the bear's stomach, and the examiner would say the stomach was, quote, packed to the brim with cocaine, thus ending the mystery of how this bear died. It died from a massive, massive cocaine overdose. But the bear story did not end there. Normally, after an animal is autopsied, they are cremated. But for some reason, this medical examiner decided not to do that, and instead, he had the bear taxidermied, and then he gifted this taxidermied bear to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area. And then from there, the bear changed hands many times. Over the next 2 decades, no one knows exactly who had the bear and for what reason, but there were reports that at least at one point it was stolen from a storage facility, and then it was sold at a pawn shop, and then at some point the bear was in the possession of famous country singer Waylon Jennings, and then finally, the bear found its forever home. Today, the bear is on display at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky, and around its neck is a placard that reads, Cocaine Bear.
In early July of 2021, 71-year-old Thomas Trizona dragged a large inflatable raft across a sandy beach on the Colorado River. It was just before sunset, and he was sweaty and tired, but happy. It was the last day of a 2-week whitewater rafting trip in the Grand Canyon, and even though he desperately needed a hot shower, Thomas felt invigorated and youthful. Thomas was a retired surgical oncologist, which means he was a doctor who operated on people with cancer. He loved being a doctor and had always been a total workaholic. But after retiring earlier this year, he finally had time for himself, and one of the first things he had done was take this adventurous vacation with his wife Amy. Whitewater rafting had been as thrilling as he had hoped it would be. They'd floated past Native American ruins and through canyons with cliff walls stretching nearly a mile over their heads. They had seen eagles, condors, and bighorn sheep. Now, on the last night of the trip, Thomas and Amy secured the raft and joined the rest of their tour group around the campfire. Thomas's stomach growled as he watched their guide grill another delicious meal for them. Thomas looked forward to dinner and then one more night of stories around the fire. Tomorrow, it would be time to return home to Springfield, Oregon. But for now, Thomas just gazed up at the setting sun, knowing he'd cherish these memories forever. On July 16th, so a few days after returning home to Oregon, Thomas sat at his dining room table feeling bloated and nauseous. His wife, Amy, had prepared a beautiful dinner, but Thomas only pushed the food around on his plate. He told Amy that his upper abdomen really hurt. He'd started to feel sick shortly after getting home from their rafting trip, and he was now starting to lose weight. And this morning, it seemed like the pain had gotten even worse. It was now coming on in these big waves. Amy suggested that maybe he ate or drank something weird on their trip. Maybe he contracted a parasite. Thomas said he only drank the filtered water, and he didn't have diarrhea, which was a common symptom of parasite infections. And anyways, if he had picked up something on the trip, then Amy would probably have it too. But when he looked at Amy and asked her how she was feeling, she just kind of shook her head and said she didn't feel sick at all. Thomas knew that his wife was probably right, and his pains were no big deal. But as a retired doctor, Thomas couldn't resist diagnosing himself. Just in case it did turn out to be something serious that required him to see his physician, Thomas began keeping a detailed journal to record all of his symptoms. He thought that this journal would help him understand what was causing his pain. Thomas had seen some heart-wrenching cases in his long career as a cancer surgeon, and as he tracked his symptoms over the next few days, he started to get nervous. He wanted to stay open-minded about what was causing his symptoms, but he couldn't help gravitating toward the dreaded disease he knew so well: cancer. Thomas reminded Amy that his mother had died of pancreatic cancer when she was only 74. In his experience, a previously healthy 71-year-old man with persistent abdominal pain and unexplained weight loss could only mean one thing. Until he was proven wrong, Thomas was certain he had cancer too. Thomas picked up his cell phone and called his close friend, Jonathan Gonen. Dr. Gonen was a gastroenterologist, a doctor who specialized in the stomach and intestinal tract. Thomas told his friend that he wanted a CT scan to figure out if he had a tumor in his abdomen. But unfortunately, the earliest appointment Dr. Gonen could get for Thomas was a few weeks away in August. Thomas hung up the phone feeling disappointed. There was nothing he could do except wait. A week later, Thomas stood in front of the bathroom mirror squeezing toothpaste onto his brush. And then he looked up and felt totally alarmed by his reflection. He was pale and gaunt, his weight was now down about 15 pounds since he'd returned from that rafting trip, and now he could barely stand from the fatigue he felt, let alone brush his teeth. Just then, a bout of nausea swept over Thomas, and he rushed to the toilet. He dropped to his knees preparing to vomit, but nothing came out. All of a sudden, he felt these severe spasms in his stomach as he fell over sideways onto the floor. The tiles were freezing cold against his cheek as he lay there shivering in just his boxers. Then he called out to his wife and said he needed to go to the emergency room right now. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat next to Amy in the emergency room's crowded waiting room. His blood had been drawn by a nurse, and he was waiting for the results. Thomas's phone pinged. He grabbed it and opened a message to find the results of his blood tests. All were normal except for one. He had elevated levels of a type of white blood cell called eosinophils. That, Thomas knew, could indicate three things: an allergy, a parasitic infection, or cancer. Thomas had already decided that he didn't have a parasitic infection, and he didn't think he had an allergy either. So that left only one possibility, the one he most suspected: cancer. Thomas asked the nurse at the reception area if he could speak directly with the doctor about the results. She told him that they had a long list of patients that day with serious problems that required immediate attention. Thomas could wait if he wanted, but it would likely be 4 or 5 hours until a doctor could see him. Thomas considered his options. He was pretty sure he did have cancer, but he knew he likely was not in any sort of immediate danger because of the cancer. And no matter what a doctor would say to him that day if he waited around to speak to one, it would still take way more testing to determine if he really had cancer or not. So Thomas stood up and told Amy they would just leave. He would deal with his cancer tomorrow. The next day, Thomas sat across the desk from his primary care physician. The doctor looked at the results on his computer as Thomas tried to describe his symptoms. And then at some point, the doctor asked Thomas about his diet and routines. And then after hearing what Thomas had to say, the doctor glanced up from the screen and told Thomas that, you know what, this is probably a dietary issue. And then he suggested Thomas try a grain-free diet. Thomas was stunned. He wanted to be screened for cancer. And now his primary physician was telling Thomas, a cancer specialist, to just try a grain-free diet? It seemed kind of asinine. And so Thomas just stood up and curtly thanked the doctor, and then took back the test results and left the building. 4 days later, Thomas was sitting at his dining room table with his laptop open in front of him when he got the best news he had received in a very long time. The results of the CT scan he'd finally been allowed to take had just come back. And the results were normal. He did not have cancer. Thomas felt an enormous wave of relief, but now he was more puzzled than ever. The pain in his abdomen had not gone away. He had barely eaten in the past 4 days, and he had now lost 22 pounds since he had returned from that rafting trip. And so Thomas was back to trying to figure out what was going on with him himself. And so while sitting at the dining room table, he began scanning through his journal with all of his symptoms he had recorded, while also going on his computer and looking up possible obscure disorders that might fit his symptoms. And as he clicked through these medical sites, he turned his attention to a chronic digestive disease in which white blood cells build up inside of the intestines, causing pain and bowel obstruction. Thomas knew that the condition, called eosinophilic gastroenteritis, was rare, but he was running out of ideas. He was growing desperate to know what was going on with him. He was in agony, both physically and mentally. And even though he was a doctor, he was completely stumped, and this made him feel so helpless. So eventually, Thomas just picked up his phone and called his friend, Dr. Gonin, to see if maybe he could help him again. A week later, Dr. Gonin paced inside of his office. He had just arranged to have Thomas have a tiny camera inserted down into his throat to look around inside of him to see if maybe he had a bowel obstruction. But like all of the other tests Thomas had undergone, this one too came back with normal results. Dr. Gonin was bewildered by his friend's case. He decided to order one more test to get a better look at Thomas's small intestine. The images on this specialized MRI would be much sharper than the CT scan, which would allow doctors to see very small problem spots. Dr. Gonin hoped the added clarity and details of the imaging would finally reveal what was wrong with his friend. The day after the MRI, Thomas went to the radiologist's office to discuss the results. Looking over the images, Thomas was surprised to see a tiny abnormality in his upper left abdomen. This abnormality was about an inch long and very, very thin. The radiologist told Thomas that the shiny spot looked more fuzzy on the earlier CT scan, and he thought it was just a buildup of plaque on Thomas's artery wall, which is a common sign of aging. But with the specialized MRI, it made it clear to the radiologist that he'd been wrong. Something strange was going on inside of Thomas's stomach. Then the radiologist had an idea. He was curious to see if this weird spot was stationary or moving around inside of Thomas, and so he offered to do another CT scan right then to find out. Thomas agreed, and they performed the scan immediately. And sure enough, it showed that the weird spot had moved in just a few weeks between one CT scan and the next. But before the two men could decide what to do about this weird moving skinny spot inside of Thomas's stomach, the radiologist noticed something else that required immediate attention. It might explain Thomas's chronic pain too. Thomas leaned in and saw on the image that there was another small spot. The doctor told Thomas that it was a gallstone, a hard mass that was growing in his gallbladder. Thomas and the radiologist stared at each other. Gallstones can cause severe pain and cause serious problems if left untreated. And so Thomas's inflamed gallbladder needed to be removed immediately. On September 13th, Thomas underwent surgery to remove his gallbladder. In the last moments before the anesthesia knocked him out, Thomas prayed that he was about to be rid of the terrible stomach pains he had endured for 2 months. A few hours after the operation was over, Thomas lay in a hospital bed resting with Amy by his side. His surgeon entered the room, walked to Thomas's bedside, and stood there grinning. The surgeon said that he had successfully removed the gallstone and the inflamed gallbladder, but that was actually not what was making Thomas sick after all. The surgeon explained that while he had Thomas's abdomen open, he decided to investigate that tiny, thin spot, the trouble spot, from the MRI scans. And he found something he had never seen before in his entire career, something that totally explained all of Thomas's symptoms: his severe stomach pain, his nausea, his weight loss, and his constant fatigue. The surgeon pulled a small vial from his pocket and held it up for Thomas to see. It contained a small object about the size and shape of a needle. Thomas asked what it was, and the surgeon said he wasn't sure, but it was very sharp, and it was inside of Thomas's intestines. And so no wonder he was in so much pain. From the looks of it, it was almost like Thomas had unintentionally swallowed a needle. Thomas leaned back in his bed, staring at this little thing inside of the vial. He couldn't believe that such a small object had caused so much misery. But he was obviously very relieved that the ordeal was now over. However, he knew he would not be able to rest easy until he figured out what this thing was that he swallowed and how he actually swallowed it. A few days later, Thomas took the object in the vial to a lab for analysis. The analyst found that it was a thin metal wire just under 1 inch long. What's more, they found a carbon pattern on the metal that exactly matched burned barbecue sauce. Thomas thought back to that last night on the Colorado River during the rafting trip and the delicious meal his guide had grilled for the whole group around the fire. That was the last grilled meat he had eaten before he started getting sick. Now everything was clear. The black metal object found in Thomas's intestine was likely a metal bristle from the brush his guide had used to clean the grates of the grill on that magical final evening of their trip. Thomas chuckled. He always knew that he would keep his memory of the Colorado trip for the rest of his life, but he didn't realize that he had also swallowed a little souvenir that would force him to remember. Here is our second story called Into the Woods. On a Saturday morning in June of 2009, a 55-year-old woman named Elizabeth and her husband Ron pulled their RV into a campsite in western Vermont. Elizabeth loved camping and took every chance she could to head for the wild, leaving behind her comfortable suburban life in Connecticut. But as she had gotten older, she had begun to enjoy the comfort of an RV. It was much nicer to sleep in a warm bed at night and not have to deal with the hassle of setting up a tent and then sleeping on the ground. The RV lifestyle was just so simple and so easy. Today, all the couple had to do was park their RV at the campsite, then put on some sunscreen, and then head out for their hike. And so, that's what they did. The dense Vermont forest they were in was beautiful, but Elizabeth had to admit that the conditions today were kind of miserable. The whole area was buzzing with these black flies that were swarming all over Elizabeth's legs and neck, and of course, Elizabeth had forgotten any bug spray. By the time she and Ron had got back to camp, every exposed part of her body was covered in bites, and over the next few hours, those bites turned into welts. Usually, whenever they went camping, Elizabeth and Ron really enjoyed lighting a campfire up at night and sitting out under the stars. But that evening, the black flies were so bad that they just stayed in the camper and played cards. Elizabeth and Ron were in good spirits, though. They'd camped in less than ideal conditions before, from freezing cold to pouring rain, and so they weren't about to let a few bug bites ruin their trip. But by the time Elizabeth changed for bed that night, her arms and legs were an unsightly mess. They didn't hurt, but all the red, swollen welts looked terrible. So she took a few ibuprofen to help with the swelling, and then she climbed into bed. The following day, Elizabeth and Ron got up and packed their bags and they headed home. And even though they had not enjoyed the black flies, they had had an overall nice time and felt energized from their weekend in the fresh mountain air. But for the rest of the week that they were home, Elizabeth battled this terrible on-again, off-again headache, and the welts from all those black fly bites were not going away. Elizabeth spent the following weekend at her niece's house in Long Island, New York. She was excited to catch up and spend some quality time with her family. But the whole time she was there, Elizabeth felt groggy, like she needed a strong cup of coffee. And then when she left and began driving back home, her headache came back full force to the point where it was just this constant, horrible throbbing pain against her temples. When she finally got home, she immediately took some ibuprofen to help with her headache, and then she drank as much water as her stomach would allow. She knew that black fly bites were not toxic, but her body seemed to be taking longer than usual to recover from them. That night, Elizabeth went to sleep early, hoping she'd wake up feeling better. But she didn't. She woke up in a cold sweat, and her stomach churned and her head pounded. She knew right away that she had a fever. Her husband, Ron, grabbed a thermometer from the bathroom, and sure enough, when he took her temperature, it was 101 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, Elizabeth was really starting to worry. She'd been sick now for more than a week, and she really didn't know how much longer this was going to last. And next weekend, she and Ron were hoping to go camping again in Vermont. They were going to meet up with Elizabeth's cousin and her cousin's husband. Elizabeth was really looking forward to the trip, but she was worried that her sickness, whatever it was, would force them to cancel. All week, Elizabeth tried to take care of herself. She stayed in bed, drank a lot of water, and ate well to help her body overcome this sickness. And finally, the morning before they were supposed to leave for Vermont, her fever broke. Throughout the day, she got better, and by that evening, she felt well enough to go camping. She was thrilled. For the first time in a week, Elizabeth got a good night's sleep, and the next morning, June 22nd, she and Ron loaded up the RV and headed back to Vermont. When Elizabeth and Ron arrived at the Winhall Brook camping ground, it was absolutely downpouring, which made it difficult to find their campsite and hook up their RV. But luckily, Elizabeth's cousin was already there and could help them get set up. When Elizabeth's cousin made a joke about the great weather they were having, Elizabeth thought about her last camping trip in Vermont and decided that she actually preferred this monsoon over swarms of black flies. Elizabeth invited her cousin and her cousin's husband into their RV, planning to cook some dinner while they waited for the rain to subside. But several hours later, the rain still had not let up, and so Elizabeth's cousin and her husband ran back to their own RV, and Elizabeth and Ron, they climbed into bed and they went to sleep, hoping that when they got up, the weather would clear and they could actually go outside and enjoy the outdoors. But the next morning, when Elizabeth woke up, the rain was not remotely on her mind. Instead, she had this blinding headache, and she also knew immediately that her fever was back. Her skin was itching and her eyes felt red. Her mouth felt gritty, almost like it was covered in little bumps. Elizabeth was annoyed, knowing she was likely going to be sick all day and could not participate in anything they were going to do. Elizabeth rubbed her eyes and slowly made her way to the bathroom to brush her teeth. She debated whether she should just ask Ron to take her home, or if she could tough it out in the RV so he could at least still enjoy the vacation. Once in the bathroom, Elizabeth spit out the toothpaste into the sink, and she noticed her spit was bright pink. And when she rinsed her mouth, she tasted blood. She opened her mouth and stuck her tongue out, and her eyes widened as she realized the bumps that she had felt inside of her mouth were these black blood blisters all along her tongue and on the inside of her cheek. Elizabeth started to feel panic rising in her chest, and so she hurried out of the bathroom and over to her cousin's RV. Luckily, her cousin's husband was actually a doctor, and so he had Elizabeth stand in their kitchenette while he looked around the inside of her mouth with a flashlight. And after a minute, he turned off the light and just shook his head. He said he had never seen a condition like this before, and he urged her to go to the hospital. Within minutes, the RV was packed up and Ron was sitting behind the wheel. Elizabeth needed to use the bathroom before they headed off, but when she urinated, it burned. Now Elizabeth was truly worried. These were not flu symptoms. Elizabeth made her way to the passenger seat up front, sitting beside Ron. By this time, her headache was back and worse than ever. She popped an ibuprofen as they pulled out of the campground, but nothing took the edge off the pain in her head or the itching that had developed all over her body. It took 2 hours of driving down winding country roads to get to the nearest emergency room in Brattleboro, Vermont. To Elizabeth, every single time they hit a bump in the road, it made her nauseous with pain. By the time they arrived, Elizabeth was in pure agony. Ron parked the RV, then walked around to the passenger door to help Elizabeth get out. When she saw him, she smiled at him, but she could see his eyes were full of fear. It wasn't until she herself looked in the rearview mirror and saw her reflection that she understood why. Her face was so swollen that she almost didn't recognize herself. About 5 hours later, Dr. Teresa Fitzharris walked into her office at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, ready to start her overnight shift. She put her purse under her desk, then went to check on Elizabeth, who was her first patient of the night. When Dr. Fitzharris walked into Elizabeth's hospital room and looked at Elizabeth, the doctor tried to hide her shock. Elizabeth's throat, chest, torso, and entire back were covered in a bumpy red rash. Dr. Fitzharris played it cool, but she'd never seen a rash this bad before. Elizabeth also had a fever of 101.6. Her heartbeat was also elevated, and her eyes were so swollen she could barely see out of them. Dr. Fitzharris sat down next to Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth began to recount the last 2 weeks of sickness and misery and all the symptoms she'd experienced since getting bit by all those black flies. Dr. Fitzharris pulled 2 rubber gloves out of a cardboard box in the storage cupboard. She put them on, then gently ran her hand down Elizabeth's arms and back. And as she did this, she frowned. She was confident that this was actually not the result of black fly bites. But Dr. Fitzharris couldn't think of any other condition that would cause a rash like this. And until she could figure it out, Elizabeth was very likely to continue to get worse. At a minimum, the rash could cause serious, lasting damage to Elizabeth's skin. Her eyes could be damaged as well, and there was no telling what this mystery condition could be doing to the inside of Elizabeth's body. Dr. Fitzharris didn't really know where to start with Elizabeth, so she just ordered some x-rays and blood work, and then went to go check on a few other patients while she waited for those things to happen. A little over an hour later, after Elizabeth had gotten the x-ray and done the blood work, Dr. Fitzharris looked over the results on the computer in her office, and to her surprise, Elizabeth's blood work and her x-rays had come back totally normal, and so Dr. Fitzharris was stumped. So she picked up the phone and called one of her colleagues, Dr. David Albright, the infectious disease doctor who was on call that night. She walked Dr. Albright through Elizabeth's symptoms, and she could hear him scribbling notes down as she spoke. And then after Dr. Fitzharris was done talking, Dr. Albright let out a long sigh. He said that most sudden fevers, like the one Elizabeth had, were caused by viral or bacterial infections, and so the problem now was figuring out which one of those she'd contracted. Because Elizabeth had been spending so much time outdoors, Dr. Albright guessed that she might have an insect-borne illness like Lyme disease or Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Dr. Albright told Dr. Fitzharris that he'd be in the next morning, and he promised to make Elizabeth his first stop. In the meantime, Dr. Fitzharris decided to put Elizabeth on antibiotics just in case she did have an insect-borne illness. If left untreated, conditions like Lyme disease or ehrlichiosis can cause organ failure. The doctor just hoped that she hadn't acted too late. Early the following morning, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of a knock at the door of her hospital room. She squinted through her swollen red eyes and saw the blurry outline of a person walking into the room. He then introduced himself as Dr. Albright and asked if the medicine that Dr. Fitzharris had prescribed was helping at all. Elizabeth groaned and shook her head no. She told Dr. Albright that she could barely see and her rash was more painful than ever, to the point where even a tiny shift in bed was extremely painful. He promised he would do everything he could to help her, and then he said he was very sorry, but he needed Elizabeth right now to sit up straight so he could determine how much her rash had spread. And so Elizabeth tried not to scream as Dr. Albright helped her sit up. Even the slightest touch on her skin was agonizing. As Dr. Albright looked over Elizabeth's body, he could see that the rash had spread, and it did not look like the medicine had helped at all. That meant his suspicion that it might be something like Lyme disease was incorrect. But unfortunately, he didn't really have any idea what else could be making her sick. Elizabeth clenched her teeth as Dr. Albright helped her lie back down. She knew the doctors were doing their best, but the fact that basically nothing had worked so far was still extremely frustrating. She could barely open her eyes and her whole body felt like it was on fire. About an hour later, Dr. Albright reappeared in Elizabeth's doorway. This time, Elizabeth could make out a second figure standing next to Dr. Albright. Dr. Albright explained that he'd brought a colleague with him who was a dermatologist or a skin doctor, and his name was Dr. Jorge Crespo. Dr. Albright wanted Dr. Crespo to take a closer look at Elizabeth's rash. He hoped that if they could determine what kind of reaction this was, it might inform them what was actually making her sick. Elizabeth braced herself for pain as the doctors once again helped her sit up so Dr. Crespo could look at her. He spent a few moments examining Elizabeth's rash, checking her eyes and the inside of her mouth. Then Elizabeth saw him nod to Dr. Albright, as if to confirm a suspicion. He told Elizabeth that she had a rare but severe kind of allergic reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Dr. Crespo explained that she'd ingested something that triggered an incredibly violent response from her immune system. Her body was so desperate to get the allergen out of her system, it attacked the deepest layers of her skin, causing the blistering rash that now covered her whole body. Soon, he believed, the top layer of her skin would start peeling off. It would look worse before it felt better, almost like she'd suffered a severe burn. None of what the doctor was saying made any sense to Elizabeth. She assured Dr. Crespo that she hadn't ingested anything unusual over the past 2 weeks. She told him again about the black fly bites and wondered if maybe any of the flies could have been carrying some kind of bacteria or virus or fungus that could have infected her. But Dr. Crespo just shook his head no. What made Stevens-Johnson syndrome very unique was not only the reaction, but the thing that caused it: medicine. For reasons doctors do not fully understand, medicines that normally improve people's health can sometimes trigger this life-threatening allergic reaction in certain patients. In Elizabeth's case, Dr. Crespo was confident that the cause was one of the most common, easy-to-get, over-the-counter medicines on the entire planet: ibuprofen. Elizabeth's jaw dropped. She'd been taking ibuprofen steadily for the last 2 weeks to reduce the swelling from all the black fly bites and to alleviate her headaches. Little did she know, the medicine was causing all of these problems. But something didn't make sense to her. She told Dr. Crespo that she'd been taking ibuprofen for as long as she could remember. If she was allergic to it, then why hadn't this happened before? Why didn't she have a big reaction the first time she took it? Dr. Crespo shrugged. He admitted that he really didn't know why Elizabeth would develop this allergic reaction so late in life. Stevens-Johnson syndrome was so rare that the root cause of it was actually still unknown. But at least Elizabeth knew now that she could not take ibuprofen, and Dr. Crespo assured her that if she stopped taking it, that she would recover in about a week or maybe 2. Elizabeth was given steroids to help reduce her symptoms, and a few weeks later, she had recovered enough to go home, just like Dr. Crespo promised. But because her allergic reaction had gone untreated for 2 weeks, some lasting damage had already been done. Elizabeth's eyes had swelled so badly that her tear ducts were permanently damaged and no longer worked. Ever since, she's had to administer saline drops in her eyes every few minutes to keep them working properly. But Elizabeth likes to look on the bright side and has said at least she can still see. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the Mr. Ballin podcast, and there's Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo.